afternoon, good evening to everyone from different parts of the world and various continents. It's good to see everybody again for our cultural storytelling when we share history, lifestyle, food and culture of various places and countries, etc. Today, we've got Anne, a very familiar face with us. For those who are old members, we have had the pleasure to hear her talking about Women of the Grand Tour and fascinating stories about lace, and always has the ability to illustrate stories through material storytelling to make it really interesting and engaging. Today, she's going to tell us about an extraordinary party which took place a little bit over 500 years ago. So, Anne, I will start putting you into the spotlight. Why this topic? Why the topic of the field of cloth of gold?
Hi, everybody. Yes, Minji, I've actually been recently writing an essay about this because I'm doing a master's in history. And I'm mainly focusing on textiles. With a name like Field of the Cloth of Gold, I thought I've got to do one essay on this. So although I'm talking generally today, the essay I've been writing is much more specialising in all the actual textiles in it. And it's just such a weird and interesting event. I thought I had to share it with you.
Great. So over to you to let us know a party of the Game of Thrones style.
Yes, it is Game of Thrones. If anybody wants to ask any questions as we go along, can you put in chat? Minji and I are going to try and keep an eye on chat if possible, and see if we can spot your questions.
Yes, so feel free. Whenever you have questions, type it in the chat box or give your comments as well, because we'd love and to tell a cultural story, but also we want to make it as interactive as possible. And should I share the PowerPoint?
Yes, yes, please put it on now.
Great. Here we go. Can everybody see it now?
I think that's it. Yeah, perfect. Okay, thanks. Yes, so the Field of the Cloth of Gold, or in French, Camp du Drap d'Or. As Minji said, this happened just over 500 years ago, last year. Do you want to go on to the next slide, Minji? The introduction. Thank you. June 1520, and this is a painting actually at Hampton Court, which unfortunately I've not been able to pop down and see, which I would have liked to have done at the moment because it's closed. But this is a painting we'll be referring to. It was actually commissioned by Henry VIII some years later to commemorate this event. And this is the Field of Cloth of Gold itself. Now, the event was held to ratify a peace treaty that had been made in October 1518 in London, called the Treaty of London, or the Treaty of Universal Peace. Has somebody still got their microphone on, Minji? I'm getting.
Yeah. Is it better now?
Possibly, yeah. Thank you. Because I could hear myself coming back. Sorry. Anyway, yeah, to ratify this peace treaty, and basically, without going into all the politics of everything, it was a sort of alliance between European states to agree not to fight each other and to support each other because they were being threatened by the advancement of the Ottoman Empire from Turkey. And so they held this peace treaty. And this was unusual for them to want to have peace because they made their names as kings by fighting battles. But anyway, they gave this a try. And this was the event that then happened to sort of celebrate this peace treaty. It was delayed slightly and then held in 1520. Although it's okay, although it was, so I was going to say about there were a number of different things that happened during this event. It wasn't just, it wasn't a diplomatic meeting in the sense there were no negotiations. It was purely a sort of party. There were tournaments, banquets, music, performances, sort of masques and religious masses all the time. And the idea of it, in a sense, was to show how powerful each of them were. So it was all supposed to be based on equality, but at the same time, it was very competitive in these different spheres, which we will look at. Okay, so the slide here now is the players, I've called it, and these are the people who took part. They weren't all actually there. The first one on the top left is Francis I, the French king, or Francois I, as the French call him. He was only 25. His queen down below in the blue, very pretty portrait, is Queen Claude, and she was 8 months pregnant, but she still came along, which I thought was very game of her. Next to Francois is Henry VIII. He was only 29 at this point, which is why he doesn't look like the image we normally see of him, because he was a lot skinnier and younger and fitter in those days. His wife's down below. That was Catherine of Aragon, his first wife he still had at that point. He hadn't got onto the whole business of having people's heads chopped off. She was still hanging on in there for a few more years. Next to Henry is, Maria's saying fake walls are better than real ones. Yes, very much so. Yeah, Catherine of Aragon doesn't look very happy in that portrait. It's true. I think she was probably getting a bit fed up with Henry by this point. He was certainly getting a little bit fed up with her, I think, because she hadn't produced the son that he needed. Next to Henry is Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey, and he was the guy who was the mover and shaker who'd organised this event. He thought of this event. He had a foot in each camp because he was the papal legate. He was a representative of the Pope, but also he was Henry's chancellor, and basically he administered the whole nation at that point. The
Red Wolf Hall.
Sorry,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, that's all right. Sorry. Hearing things, I'm getting voices. Anyway, so Cardinal Wolsey was he was playing one against the other basically for his own ends, but it made him very important. It also made Henry important, this event, as we'll be discussing. The other two people weren't actually there. On the right of Wolsey is the Pope, Leo X. So he was, one of the main powers in Europe at that time, obviously the papacy. And down the bottom right is the most powerful person of all at that period. This was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was only 20 years old and had recently been elected the previous year. So these were three. He wasn't there, but he met Henry immediately before the event, and he met Henry immediately after the event. So it was a lot of power sort of battles going on at this point. So those are the main people involved. If you go to the next slide, please. Right. Yeah, so just briefly, there's the actual peace treaty on the right. I won't read it to you because I can't. And the map, just briefly, is to show the sort of powers in Europe. You can see England at the top. We only had a very small population of 3 million at that point. France, directly beneath us, was 11 million. So you can see that England was sort of playing above its weight in this thing because we were quite a small power. And then you have Spain, obviously, on the left, and then to the right of France is all the territory controlled by the Holy Roman Empire and Charles V. So you can see how powerful that was. So this was all to do with the sort of politics of the era. Just to give you a bit of background. If we go on to the next one. Yes, so cloth of gold, exactly. Why is it called the cloth of gold? For a couple of reasons. Obviously, you can see the gold tents there. It was to do with the decoration, and part of the way that kingship was expressed in those days was by rituals, ceremonies, and material goods. Because if you think of the population of England, the peasants and everywhere else in Europe, they were living in very poor circumstances. And if you saw the king ride by on his horse in this glittering costume, you realized that there was a difference between him and you. And, it sort of reinforced the right of kingship. So it's partly that. But if you go to the next slide, please, Mindy. But cloth of gold has, thank you. But cloth of gold's actually got a more specific meaning as well, because If you look on the right, that's a funeral pall, the cloth that goes over a coffin during a funeral ceremony. And the top part is actually cloth of gold. This is in the V&A. You can go and see it when the museum reopens if you're in England. And cloth of gold is actually woven cloth. So it's a cloth with gold threads woven into it. And the way they do this is they take gold and beat it into thin sheets like tinfoil, cut it into strips, and then wind the strips of gold around silk, very fine silk threads. And then they weave that into the material. So it's a very specific thing. They have cloth of silver as well, the same thing, but with silver. Beneath the red, you can see around the edge of the pall is our decorations of figures. Now that's embroidery on velvet, I think. And that would also be, for the purposes of cloth of gold here, that would be included in the sort of golden sort of reputation of the thing, because it was of the event, because it was all of those things. But technically, it's only the woven cloth that's cloth of gold. And you can see Henry, a later portrait on the left, and he's demonstrating this because you've got the sleeves in what looks like gold silk, beautiful, probably Venetian or from Lyon. These are the famous silk weavers of this period in Europe. But then you've got all the embroidery on his costume in gold thread as well. So all of that would be included in the sort of gold of this event. Next slide, please. I just quickly wanted to say there's marvelous archives for this event because it's such a famous event. And anybody's interested in it, there's a lot that's digitalized. And if anybody wants to contact me, I can give them links if they're interested. But the British Library's got books that you can view. There's Hall's Chronicles. So there's a lot that you can see. And particularly in England, you have the wardrobe records. That's the Royal Wardrobe, which is the department that dealt with costume and furnishings for the English crown. And they have very, very specific records, which is amazing. Next slide, please. So we're off to the event now. And this is a companion portrait to the one we've seen already, and it's made for Henry. There's no artist, nobody knows who painted it, it's anonymous. And so this is from Dover as they were setting off. The event was held in Calais, just to the south of Calais, which we'll look at in a bit. So obviously the English court had to cross the narrow sea, as they called it in those days. Now we call it the English Channel. Well, we do anyway. From our side, we call it the English Channel. And this is an illustration. It's highly exaggerated. But what's interesting, you can just see Henry's ship in the background with its gold sails, which he did put up for this thing. He had special gold sails for this event. Wow. I know. And they said, somebody commented about it, said it was more like a luxury yacht than a warship, this particular ship. What's particularly funny about this is if you look at the characters going on, queuing up to get on the boat, when you look at the records, they took people on these boats in order of precedence. So basically there were 12,000 people attended this event, 12,000 people. So there were 6,000 English people and 6,000 French, and it was all perfectly matched. Everything had to be equal. And there's a record of one of these, because they were crossed in batches, because this went on for about a month before the event started, they were crossing. And there's a list on one of them. It sounds like Noah's Ark. I'll just read it. And it was, one crossing had 2 dukes, 1 marquis, 10 earls, 4 bishops, 27 knights, 16 heralds, 200 yeomen of the guards, 266 officers of the household, 205 stable and armory people, musicians and others, amounting to 935 people. So they all went on these ships, just like Noah's Ark, really. And what I also think about, what a huge logistical operation it was to get all these people and huge amounts of furnishings, costume, all sorts of things. Yeah, 2 French hens, they got those when they got to France. Somebody's just commented about Mark has. Yeah, we're going to talk about Calais in a minute. Yes. Yes, so huge logistical operation. And you imagine everybody going from London and from Canterbury, which is where Henry had been before, through the countryside with these huge wagon trains of cartloads. There were 50 cartloads in one procession. And what I found interesting is they weren't dressing in traveling clothes. They dressed up as if they were in a procession. So you imagine being in a little English village and you suddenly see hundreds of people dressed in gold and, cloth of gold and marvelous costume passing through your village. There must have been the talk for years afterwards, about that. It must have been amazing. Yeah, I've got some questions about the food. We'll be talking about the food in a minute, but yes, they did bring their own food, and they got food when they got there, and they took livestock. They didn't kill it until they wanted to eat it. So yeah, It would have been very much Noah's Ark. Anyway, next slide, please. Yes, so here we are. This is a section of the picture again, and that's Calais in the distance, and then the procession. And you can see Henry right front center in cloth of gold, because he's a king, he has a best costume and be most noticeable. But yes, somebody's asking about Calais. Yes, it was interesting. The English still held a small foothold in northern France, Calais, and a little bit of area around there. And this event was actually held on English soil. And it was a sort of compromise. Like I said, everything had to be same sort of precedent. So because Henry got to hold it on English soil, France has got to make all the decisions about what sort of tournaments and things. So it was all quid pro quo. And it was held on English soil, this little bit of land, which they later lost. It was, it was lost in the 1550s. So I'm just reading this next question. Yes, we're going to talk about exactly that. This is just like when I do my tours at the V&A, everybody asks questions just before we get to it, which is brilliant. It shows they're paying attention. We're talking about that. Sumptuary laws, if I go onto it. Yes, the dragon. I notice you like it. This is the Game of Thrones. I think Minji's far too excited about Game of Thrones reference. But we will talk about the dragon a little bit later. Dragons are not normally native to northern France, I have to tell you, but there was a dragon. Okay, so next slide, please. I'm just going to go. Okay, so they all arrived in France. Henry stayed in Calais for a few days. In fact, he didn't sleep in tents. We're talking about the glamping in a bit. But he slept. There were two castles on the edge of this field, nearby. The two towns were Guines and Arge, and the French stayed in Arge, and the king stayed in the castle there, and Henry stayed in the castle at Guines, but everybody else slept in the tents basically, unless they could get houses in town. They had these people who were who we called harbingers. I didn't know that's where harbinger came from. The English called them harbingers, and these are the people who went out and sourced places to rent, because it was such a huge operation. They had things like they'd take over a house and use it as a bakery for the English court, or they'd take over a shop in Calais and use it as a butchery. So there were all sorts of things like that. So basically they just took over the whole area. So the first meeting happened after a few days. This was the first time these two kings had ever met. And this was part of the reason why they wanted to get together. It was ego, young, athletic kings wanted to see who was the best, basically, and compete. And there's a whole, I won't go into all the details, but the meeting's very funny because it's in a field and they had to level off one corner of the field to make sure it wasn't higher, so that anybody was higher off, status-wise. Neither were quite sure whether they were going to ambush the other side, so they weren't quite sure whether it was going to be a peace thing. So they all had lots of English archers in the background and French foot soldiers and things. And then they sounded a trumpet to say this is a time to set off. So they both moved across the field at the same pace and met in the middle by this small tent that was set up, covered in cloth of gold and tapestries and thrones and wine and all sorts of things. The tent was. And then they had this sort of pantomime that they had to bow to each other and doff their hats at the same time, get off the horses at the same time, all that sort of thing. You can see Cardinal Wolsey on a horse just to the right of the kings. as well. But that was the first meeting. They got on very well, apparently, straight off. So they hit it off straight away. Next slide, please.
I just want to make a comment. What an
Yep.
unusual sketch that is. Because
yeah, I mean, this is a Victorian thing. The whole thing about the cloth of gold is, like a lot of these events, they take on a life of their own afterwards. So they symbolize things. And when you had the medievalism and so on in Victorian era, there was a lot, and also they were teaching history to children much more. So I imagine this is a sort of late Victorian print of some sort, you know, teaching about the history of England and France, obviously. And also certain events became more important. You emphasize, you see history through your own lens. So, you know, this, we'll talk about it. It was to do with chivalry and so on. A lot of the heraldry and chivalry is involved in this event. The Victorians liked that, so it became a popular event again. Yeah, interesting. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get on to the tents, which are the main thing. Glamping gone mad. You're never going to go glamping like they did. It's the most extraordinary event. There's a document in the British Library which is digitalized, so you can look at it, and it's got these wonderful illustrations of some of the tents that they think were the ones from the Field of Cloth of Gold. This huge red one, as I was just saying, chivalry. They had the idea, they thought they were Renaissance princes and they had humanist ideas, but at the same time they were very informed by chivalry. So you had knights, you had crusades, you had the whole concept of chivalry as a way of that knights, a sort of code of conduct for the knights and how they should comport themselves in society and be honourable and so on. And Henry very much still following this sort of chivalric code. And part of it is heraldry. So you show your membership of a group or like a royal household, or depending on which group, by heraldry. So you see the tents here, they have all these heraldic figures on it to do with the coats of arms. There's a question here. There's a whole aspect of which this was nostalgia festival, wasn't there? Not sure it was nostalgia at the time. I think they were at a time, well, yes, you're right, Sue, because what it's saying is they were sort of modern. You know, the Renaissance was just hitting England. We were very slow to come to the Renaissance of England. And there's this sort of humanist values of education and improvement and so forth, and the Reformation. But before that was chivalry, and it's sort of at the cusp of those two different, a transitional sort of thing in a sense. Next slide, please. These are just two more of the tents from the illustrations. The green and white is the livery colours of Henry VIII. So his livery, his servants and so on, and followers would be wearing green and white quite often. And the French court, it was tawny, which I presume is supposed to be represented by that gold in there and the blue and so on. So there's various different colours. And they had sailors and so on came to put up all the rigging, because you imagine it was quite technically difficult. Next slide, please. So if we're competing on the tents, the definite winner was Henry. He didn't win everything in this whole event, but he definitely won on this tent, because this was this amazing wonder of the world. And this was his, it was a sort of court, a miniature palace. It was a fake palace built in the field. And it was huge. In fact, it was huge. It was bigger than it looks in the sim, because it was square and it was 100 meters long. So that's 328 feet long. It was a tent. They nicknamed it the Crystal Palace because it had some glass windows, which is quite funny because you think of 1851 and the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition, but this was the first Crystal Palace. It actually was a tent. So you have the base was, they had a sort of 6-foot base of brickwork, which they had people come over and build. And then the rest of it was wooden frames with canvas, and the canvas was painted to look like brickwork. And that's what it was. And when you went inside, there was a little inner courtyard, and then there was a big staircase, wooden staircase that went up to the first floor because there were 2 floors on it. And it was divided into 4 sections. So there were sections for banqueting halls, retiring rooms for the king, and then there was actual accommodation. This is where Cardinal Wolsey actually actually stayed. His lodgings were in this place. So it was an amazing, amazing building. I like the figures on the top. It looks like they're throwing things down at the crowds below, which is rather. And this whole thing about faking things is all to do with Tudor court. They love puzzles and plays on words, metaphors, and all sorts of things like this. And so this creation was really Henry saying, you know, we're a small power, we've got a small population, we're on the edge of Europe, but we're powerful too, and we can really compete. Okay, the next slide, please. I say, because this is a bit blurry because it's right on the part of that picture, but this is a tilt yard. So one of the major features of this whole thing was the war games. In effect, like I was saying, it's Henry saying, I can produce things, I can produce goods, as good, you know, as good as you can, I can, you know, I can compete. But very much he's saying, I can produce the soldiers and the archers, and I'm as good as you in terms of warfare. And although we're having peace now, you know, the click of the fingers, we can be, you know, gearing up and fighting you for real. So this is what they were both saying. We're equally powerful and we're equally capable of fighting you. Although we're not at the moment, because we're Renaissance princes who want peace today. You know, so this is a tilt yard where they had jousting and so on. And yeah, I just want to go, stay on the previous one a minute, because they had lots of different types of combat. They had archery, they had wrestling, they had displays of horsemanship, they had jousting, which we'll see in a minute, and then they had things like what did I miss out? Jousting. Mock battles. They had mock battles, and it was all done in teams. So it wasn't the French against the English. It was always a mixed team. And because they weren't competing, they were friends, you know. And Henry and Francis both competed, and the idea wasn't to kill each other with this, you know. It's the thing. I must talk about the tree briefly. It's the most weird thing. It's a fake tree. They built it, and it was all composed of different woods, and it was supposed to imitate different trees, and it's really strange. But what it is, you see the things hanging from it. So you have the coats of arms of the competitors, plus they had some shields, and what you did, which indicated different events, it's a bit like the Olympics, and you apparently touched your lance against the thing. So if it was a jousting thing, you touched the jousting shield before you went to compete. It's something like that. That was the idea. So it's all very weird and well organized though. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is a Victorian picture of the jousting. They blunted the lances and everything because they didn't want to kill each other. The ladies would be up, and others would be watching. So that would be the chivalric thing that you're fighting on behalf of your ladies. So Steve's saying about hurting. Yes, they didn't want to kill each other, but this was a very dangerous sport. Years later, Henry was very seriously injured whilst jousting. He fell off and he was actually unconscious for about 20 minutes. You imagine if you were the courtiers and Henry's unconscious for 20 minutes, you wouldn't be happy. Even more seriously, poor old Francis's son, when he was king, he was killed in a joust when a splinter came off and went under his visor. And he lived long enough to pardon the chap who'd killed him, actually, you know, who'd inflicted this wound before he died. So, I think Henry's wives weren't happy because that made him, when he had this injury on the jousting, he injured his leg, which never recovered. And he got all these sores, and he was like a bear with a wounded paw after that because he was in pain for the rest of his life. So his wives definitely weren't happy about that, unfortunately. Okay, next one, please. Somebody mentioned the Royal Armouries at the start, one of you, and yes, if you go to the Royal Armouries website, there's a marvellous website full of information about all this, and this is actually Henry VIII's suit of armour that he wore for this event. there was quite a funny little thing that happened with this, because you see the first one with the white background, this was the suit that was made. Marvelous decoration. You can see Tudor roses on it, a man on a horse jousting, all sorts of details. But what happened was Francis got to choose the events, and he suddenly announced he wanted a certain type of armor, which is tonnelet armor, and it's the armor on the left with a skirt. So they actually had to build this skirt for it, which was, they didn't have enough metal, and they had to send to Flanders for it. So it always caused a lot of problems. But anyway, if you're interested in the armour, definitely go to the Royal Army's website. It's fantastic information about it. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is from the same book as the other illustrations of the tents, and these are some of the costumes. There's not a lot of costume left now from this period. It's early, and so we can only find costume from illustrations like this, portraits of the day, and funny enough, tapestries, because when they made tapestries, they often put people in contemporary dress. So even if you made a tapestry, there's the Devonshire tapestries, for instance, in the V&A, they were made in the 1400s, and they're showing sort of antique hunting scenes, but everybody's dressed in the latest fashions. And so you can date fashions by looking at tapestries. So, but these are some nice illustrations. And as we said before, you know, you've got the concept of chivalry, you've got the concept of livery and so on, membership of groups. And so they're showing membership of different groups. I imagine the guy here is some sort of, in the blue and gold, is some sort of herald or something for Henry, because he's wearing Henry's colours. But they wore different outfits. It's very strange. I was reading about it. They had all these different allegorical costumes for this event. So every day there were 2 sessions, and there were, I don't know, 10 days of it. So they had 8 days of these tournaments. And so they had 16 different outfits, and every outfit had all sorts of little allegories on it. It's very strange. And you were supposed to guess what these allegories were. Very strange. And even the chroniclers can't make their minds up about what some of these were about. Anyway, next slide, please. Yeah, the pictures in this book, it is contemporary. It is of this period. I wouldn't say it's the same year, but it's certainly contemporary. It's a book in the British Library, and it's about warfare. So there's all these pictures, little drawings of battles, but they think it's definitely the cloth of gold. And it's certainly 1500s, this book. The 2 costumes a day. I think there were 16 in a team, I think it was. It weren't huge numbers competing each day, although they did have these mock battles at one point, like ground warfare. But it was, I think I read, it was something like 8 days of it, and they had 2 sets of costumes a day, plus there were 16 people in each team, something like that. You know, I wouldn't swear on it, but it was those. It's not huge numbers. But they also had these masks as well, which were other performances. So they had these masks, and then they had the different costumes. It was a huge undertaking. These are the horses that were used for the jousting. And they think the one on the right is actually Henry VIII, because he's got the Tudor roses all over the horses. They call it caparisoned when the horses have got these costumes on. Just reading the thing. It was a large team or not. All it needed to be shipped from England for the event. Yeah, I mean, they had basically a year or so to prepare for it. And the Royal Wardrobe went mad making all this stuff and buying it and so forth. And we'll talk about the textiles, but the textiles came from all over Europe. And they had the best of the best. And also the nobles paid for their own, because what happened was, when they knew they were going to have the event, Henry's people, his courtiers, send out a letter to all these nobles. And there's one copy of one of these letters still in existence, apparently. And it said something like, "You're invited to this event. Come and wear your best clothes." That was basically it. And they had to pay for these clothes. They didn't get any subsidy. So they had to turn up with their own entourage, their own people. Yeah, it was all to do with status, prestige. Exactly that, Steve. It was all to do with that. It was to do with magnificence and splendor. It was Henry saying, we're as good as you are. And it was interesting because we only had less than a third of the population of France. So when he brought his nobles, Henry basically brought all of his nobles who'd turn up, whereas the French could pick and choose because they had more nobles because there were more of them. So really we were the poor guys in a sense turning up, but you know, yeah, these are just some pictures of the costume of the period to give you an idea. I've absolutely no idea what that funny thing is that guy is holding next to the woman on the bottom. Yes, no idea what that is. I've been looking at it all week. It looks like wings. No idea what that is. But anyway, just some pictures of the costume of the period. And we were affected by the fashions. You imagine you spend a fortnight with these people. And we started adopting French fashions after that because obviously the court thought, oh, these are nice. We'll dress like that from now on. Okay, next slide, please. So talking about textiles, it's very interesting that there's this sort of European network of trade that had been going on for many centuries by then. And certain areas were specialising in certain things. And when you were in a court in Europe, you always wanted the best of the best. You didn't want to be just wearing your own local stuff if it's not the best. So there were merchants in London, there were foreign merchants, the Hanseatic League, there were Flemish merchants in London, there were Venetian merchants in London in the city, and English merchants, and they were all buying. So these are Venetian velvets, the best velvets. Yeah, silk did come from China. It was imported for thousands of years from China to Europe. And then what happened was the Venetian Republic were importers from China, and then they started weaving their own silk, and then they started importing the raw silk from the Middle East, from the Levant, who started growing it, and then they started growing it in Europe and Sicily and so on. Never in England, but there's the producers of silk, and then there's the producers of cloth, and those are separate things. But it's fantastic to think that the Romans wore silk, and they had no idea what it was and how it was produced. And nobody, they think, from the Roman Empire ever got to China, and vice versa, although there's rumours and so on, because of the vast distance. So it was chains of merchants. You know, it took a month to cross the deserts and so on. So you had these wonderful cloths that the Romans were wearing. It had no idea. They thought it was like cotton. But anyway, it's a different story. So these are some of the fantastic Venetian silks that they were wearing, and you can see the absolute superb quality of it. And also Lyon in France, which became a major producer of stunning silk, had been going about 50 years by that point. That little green one that you're pointing to, Minji, that's one of my favourite little pieces in the V&A. It dates from the 1400s. Next slide, please. So amazing textiles. Wrestling, before we leave the events, I have to mention wrestling. You know, I was saying how Henry won on the architecture front, the tents. He definitely lost on the wrestling front. What happened was, it's a famous sort of thing that people talk about with relation to this. They never competed directly against each other, except one day, and I think Henry and Francis had probably been having a drink or two, and Henry suddenly suggested that he and Francis have a quick wrestling match. And what he unfortunately didn't know was that Francis had been trained by these famous Breton wrestlers and threw him to the ground in about 2 minutes flat. And so he didn't like that. He wanted to do best of three, which Francis didn't want. I have to tell you, though, that this is a typical thing, that it was only mentioned in the French explanations and descriptions of this event, which could be considered propaganda, or it could be considered sensible on the part of the English chroniclers not to mention it. But you can see from the pictures, this thing took on a life of its own, and these are sort of, there's Victorian cartoons about it. It became a sort of metaphor for you know, conflict between nations. So Henry definitely lost that one. Next slide, please. Food and drink, this is what you all want to know about. Huge quantities. Imagine feeding 12,000 people for 18 days in the middle of a field. As I said previously, they set up kitchens everywhere. There were small, there was feeding people on a daily basis, plus these huge set banquets. And these banquets, the kings never sat at the same banquet because of orders of precedence. They had to be equal. So one king was banqueted by the queen of the other one. So they all swapped over. Part of the thing of being a medieval king was to show largesse, so hospitality. So it's vitally important. They'd have at least 50 dishes at a banquet and gold plate and all sorts of fancy things. There's not a description of these banquets, but I've got a description of a similar banquet, and I'll just read this out. The first course consisted of dishes of pork, brawn and mustard, pottage, beef, mutton, stewed pheasant, swan, capon, suckling pig and venison pie or pastry. The course ended with the serving of a subtlety or table decoration made from a variety of materials such as spun sugar or marzipan, also called marchpane. And if you look at the thing with the blue shield in the middle, that would be a marzipan, one of these subtleties. There's lots on YouTube because a lot of English history programs have done things about food, and there's all sorts of examples. It's probably on YouTube where people are making these things, but they would make things like a castle made out of spun sugar, or heraldic devices and things. The venison, you're saying about nearly bankrupted. There was a lot of talk about this whole event bankrupting people who decided to go there. That was a common theme. They don't think it actually did, but there was a lot of talk about that. People were moaning about it, as you can imagine. The venison, the deer, was brought from the royal parks. They were going killing them just before and bringing them over. So Leeds Castle in Kent, places like that, they're not too distant. They brought venison. So for the English records, this is just the English records, 3,400 sheep and lamb were accounted for, with 842 veal calves, 373 oxen, and 69 pigs. The fish was amazing, the amount of fish. 29,500 fish, including plaice, flounder, conger eels, turbot. There was also one dolphin. Now, I can't imagine a dolphin's very tasty to eat, but it was it was a play on words, they think, because Henry's daughter Mary, who was 2, was betrothed to the son of the King of France, who's known as the Dauphin. They think it was a play on words that they had this poor little dolphin just for that reason. I wonder what they would be talking. Could see French still being something. According to use French. Well, they did use it, French, because they were Normans after the Norman conquest, but it gradually died out. And there is some talk in the records and the books I've been reading about this, that they did use translators. There were payments of sums to translators at some points in these events. And they think that in the actual courts, obviously the French court, they spoke French, but the English court, the more sophisticated courtiers might be fluent in French, but the people who'd come from the shires, the nobility from Lancashire or Yorkshire, wouldn't speak French. So they did use translators for some of it. I taught connected Dauphin, the translation of Wonder for years. Yeah, it's a play on words about the Dauphin. People would they like these sort of little puzzles and games. The guilds and trades, yes, they were involved. A lot of this stuff was bought from merchants in the City of London, and the crafts would have been making it. Yes, definitely. The guilds were involved, and the Hanseatic League, who had a big presence in the City of London. There were individual merchants. There's talk that even Henry was interested, and he would have merchants, he'd meet merchants who, say a Florentine silk merchant would come and show him some designs, and he would choose it. It is a sort of PR event, but it's more than a PR event in a sense. It had quite a profound meaning. It's deeper than a PR event, because if you think of kingship, you know, you think now of kingship. How do you show that you're king? You know, you have documents, but you're a peasant in the north. You've never seen, you know, a seal of the king or coronation ceremony. And they showed themselves to their people, and they showed themselves to their people wearing glorious clothes. Because if you meet a billionaire tomorrow in the street and he's wearing the most expensive suit you've ever seen, it sets him apart from you. And it's like that. It's like, and you think Henry VIII had a very short, you know, only his father had taken power, so he had a very tenuous hold on kingship. So he was having to big himself up as much as possible, you know. And Francis was a young king as well, so it was deeper level than a PR event. It was a PR event, but it was a deeper level. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, we have to have the fountains of wine. Fountains of wine are a surprisingly frequent event in English history, I've come to realise, because I've just been writing about coronations generally, and there's frequently fountains of wine. If any of you know Cheapside in the City of London, there was always a fountain of wine there, free wine for, not every day, but for when there's a coronation. So these two fountains outside Henry's palace were flowing with free wine. White wine in one and claret in the other, even, with a silver cup for anyone to drink. There was also ale on supply because it was described as the natural drink of Englishmen. Of course, you can imagine, especially looking at this picture, that this free wine caused certain problems. No, nothing was on the Cheapside. I'm just reading the Cheapside is named after Cheap because that was the market centre of London, and that's how the word cheap from chap develops, funny enough. But anyway, yeah, so the Knight Marshal at this event in Field of Gold was the sort of chief police officer in effect. And it says here in one of the quotes, he was empowered to ensure the exclusion of boys and vile persons and punishment of vagabonds and mighty beggars, not permitting any of them to remain lying about or near unto the court. And what that basically means is a lot of people were sneaking in to join in the fun. So he had to see them off, basically. You can imagine, it's like, it's the equivalent of getting over the fence at Glastonbury Festival. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, it did rain at one point. Yeah, yeah, I mean, it did rain, I have to say. In fact, poor old Francis's tent was knocked down in a storm. Bless him. Some of the English tents were knocked down as well, but not Henry's big palace, you know. Okay, so you had the event. At the end of the event, you had this big final mass. What they did, they took down the tilt field and they put up a temporary stadium, a stage, for an outdoor religious event. And you had Francis's team on one side and Henry's in the other, surrounded by tapestries and cloth of gold for an outdoor church service. And something went wrong because the dragon appeared, basically. Now, the dragon was, they think, nobody's 100% sure, but they think it was a giant kite. And it turned up in the middle of the service that Thomas Wolsey was giving the final mass. I imagine it was supposed to turn up at the end, and it got there a bit quick, probably because it was a windy day. And I must just read you this wonderful description I found of this. This is some chronicler. I have to say this must be an English chronicler by reading it. And here's the description of the dragon. Lo, flying in great loops, a splendid and hollow monster stretched out in the sky over the earth, a dreadful monster of immoderate size, thanks to the cunning art of English, constructed on the inside from hoops and on the outside woven from cloth. This shapeless monster is a dragon. From the skies of Ardre it flies to green. This artificial dragon, fashioned by the great skill of the English, its eyes blaze, and with quivering tongue it licks its mouth, which opens wide. The dragon hisses through its gaping jowls. It makes a sound as it advances over the earth with rustling winds, while its great grey body cleaves a path through the air. They think it was a dragon. I think it was supposed to be the Welsh dragon, or they think it was a tribute to Francis because his symbol was a salamander. So they think it could be a salamander or it could be a Welsh dragon. But what they think it was a kite with a sort of firebox on the mouth, so it looked like it was breathing fire. But there you go. So that was the dragon, and that was, oh, just dropped my notes. Sorry. That was the end. But I just want, the costume. Talking about the wonderful costume. Opus Anglicanum was English embroidery, and we've talked about the wonderful Venetian velvets and the French velvets, but what the French silks. But what the English were famous for in this period, in fact, for 200 or 300 years before, was this very fine ecclesiastical embroidery called Opus Anglicanum, and this is the sort of things they would be wearing to the this church service that the priests would be wearing. Most exquisite embroidery, and there was a lot of that taken. There's one or two pieces still in existence that were supposed to be more. Absolutely amazing. Next one, please. And at the end, they gave lots of gifts. You can imagine they gave lots of gifts. Again, it all had to be equal. They gave gifts, lots of gifts to all the craftsmen and the people who organised it and all those sort of things. And then the queens at the banquets gave out prizes such as jewels and rings to the victors in these tournaments, you see. So if you won a tournament, you got, it's like the Olympics. So you got a prize. Plus there were gifts like this. There's not a lot of the gifts that still recognised. They don't know what happened to most of them, but this is one that they think was given. Absolutely exquisite. It's a jewel box, and they think it's enamel. Well, they know it's enamel and gilt copper casket, probably a jewel box. It's in Geneva now, apparently. And they think it was given by Francis to Cardinal Wolsey as a thank you for organising the event. And when Wolsey fell out of favour, it went to Henry VIII, who then gave it to Anne Boleyn. So it's been around a bit, that casket. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is the field of the cloth of gold today. When I say today, that's the one on the right with the field. There is still a field there with an obelisk saying field of cloth of gold, Capitule d'Or. They want to excavate it to make sure it's exactly the right field, but they think that is the exact field. And on the left was just something I found on the internet. You can go and stay in a glamping experience in some, I suppose it's a hotel complex, sports complex in the area, in fancy tents. It's supposed to replicate it. It's quite funny because in the marketing blurb they talk about tapestries and so on. So they've obviously done their research, but you can go glamping yourself. Unfortunately, there should have been a lot of events last year for the 500th anniversary, but of course it's all cancelled due to the epidemic, unfortunately. The legacy of the cloth of gold, the field of the cloth of gold, they were all fighting each other in a few years. The peace didn't last. However, there are lots of different, theories about whether it's important or not. But it is quite important to think of meetings between leaders, Yalta, G7 conferences, Nixon, and all these sort of people, and how important actually meeting people face to face is for building up relationships. And that, I think, is part of the legacy of the field of cloth of gold. Any more questions, please?
So let's take a look of the
let's see what we got.
The chat. But this is fascinating. Thanks for in a way bring the past event live, showing this extraordinary Game of Thrones party. Now, from now on, if we want to organize glamping, we have a reference point. We know what to prepare.
When I get my time machine, I'm going straight there. Dress up first, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't mention sumptuary. Somebody asked about the costume. Yeah, there were sumptuary laws that normally only the royals could wear cloth of gold. And it's the same with purple and ermine and things like that. There were very strict laws, but the king could alter them at different times. And I think he did. And I noticed, I've just been doing about Charles II and his coronation procession, lots of people wearing cloth of gold. So I think he gave them a sort of special dispensation to wear it on certain occasions. It did affect British fashion. We started becoming, wearing more French fashions, but actually during Henry's reign, we became much more affected by European fashion and culture and Renaissance culture than we had been. And in his inventory towards the end of his life, they were showing he had costumes, he had Turkish costumes, he had French, Italian style, he had a lot of costume from different traditions of fashion. So he was very affected. Yeah, they didn't have balls. They had, somebody's asking about balls in the evening. They had entertainments, they had choirs and singing and all sorts of things. And they had these big banquets, some of which went on for 4 hours, but they had masks, which are the equivalent. So the mask is a sort of, it's like a ball. You turn up in these weird costumes. These are the ones with the allegories, more even than the jousting ones, but the allegories on these things. So you'd have a sleeve with one thing on and it's just weird things. And they'd turn up with these masks on and you were supposed, they thought it was quite risque at the time because a lady could be talking to somebody, she didn't know who it was, because they were in disguise, and they would wear all these masks. And there's a whole list, like Henry was dressed as Hercules, so it's mythological characters. So they had these amazing, like masked balls. The field is about 10 miles south of Calais. That's where it is. Yeah, it did cost a fortune. The whole event cost a fortune. It was equivalent of 1 year's expenditure on the court normally. This event. I mean, they took a lot of the stuff back with them. I mean, not the food, but they took a lot of the costume and everything back. They reused. Costume was constantly reused and remade. It was never thrown away or sold. It was just remade the whole time, reused all the elements of costume.
My question would be a little bit controversial. So back then, Tudor era, it looks like there's a lot of communication and get in touch between Britain as an island and continental Europe.
Yeah.
What would be the British identity at the time? Would they consider as part of Europe, or?
No, we were considered a backwater, which we still are. We were particularly considered a backwater. I mean, Europe wasn't as I mean, Europe was constantly under flux, itself. Countries we see as European countries now didn't exist. It was, different amalgamations at different times as power battles went on and wars were fought, and this town was 1 minute it was French, the next minute it was, Flemish or whatever. So this went on the whole time. But we were just a complete little backwater, fighting our own battles, War of the Roses, and everything. And then Henry VII took over, and then Henry's father. And then when Henry took over, Wolsey was very ambitious, and Henry was ambitious. Henry was like young, fit, athletic, keen to go, and he didn't have the money to fight. Normally, you'd make your name by fighting lots of battles, but he didn't have the money to fight all these battles. So that's why the idea of this peace, he tried it, he'd been over fighting in France previously, but that's why this peace treaty, and this was a time when humanist ideas of peace were coming in. And so it suited everybody to have this sort of particular sort of event. Right.
Questions coming up.
Yeah, I'm just having a looking. They didn't produce silk. No, it was interesting with the Romans. The Romans wore silk, but they had no idea what it was. You imagine silk if you've no idea how it's produced. They thought it came like cotton off trees. But what was happening is the silk merchants, the Silk Road, were coming for like 2,000 years. They're bringing silk to Rome, but they didn't know what it was. The people, the Romans, didn't know what it was, how it was produced. It was a secret. It was the Chinese held that secret for 2,000. Well, they think 2,000 years. It goes far back in history, silk production, and then eventually 2 monks, they smuggled some silk cocoons in a walking stick, supposedly. They'd died if they'd been caught, and they brought cocoons to the West. This is the story, the legend. So they were using it, but they didn't produce it, and they didn't know how it was produced, which is just this amazing. And you think even nobody had gone from China to Rome, and no single person had gone from Rome to China. It was a series of merchants over thousands of miles. Just incredible. What part did the new Holy Roman Emperor play in the event? He hung around the edge. When he found it was happening, he suddenly decided he had to go and visit his aunt, who was Catherine of Aragon, and his uncle by marriage, Henry, who had never shown any interest before. So he suddenly decided he had to go and visit them before, which he did in Canterbury, literally a few days before. And then as soon as the event was over, he was in Flanders nearby, and he visited them again. So he was trying to sort of get in on the action because he saw his power being eroded. But he was hugely powerful anyway. So in the end, he wanted Henry to make an alliance with him rather than with Francis, which eventually it all fell apart anyway. The idea of Europe came from the 8th century. So I say from the mainland, it wanted to be a thing that it could belong to, since obviously then it disappeared. All right. Yes, the Irish were very advanced, and the monks, of course, were the thing with the education.
We can ask, and this talk can go on forever.
Yes, I know.
And thanks for another really informative and really interesting, engaging visit to the past events. And we hope to have you back for another talk.
Yeah, one of these days.
Yeah, fantastic. Great as usual. Now I'd like to invite Ploy to talk about next week's another very interesting cultural storytelling.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Minji and Anne, for this wonderful session. Next week we are taking you to Vietnam. So I know that all of us have known Vietnam as a good hub for Vietnamese food, delicious street food. But next week we have a couple guests who Spring and Ho, who have been a tour guide for over 5 years and welcome 3,000 guests to Ho Chi Minh City. Next week, they will be talking about definitely Vietnamese food, hidden gems, and untold stories about Vietnam from the Vietnamese perspectives that related to the, past wars and also the history of Vietnam and also the culture. We will understand more why they are what they are, and next time when you visit Vietnam, you will understand more and you will be able to explore more of Vietnam. So I hope you can join us next week, and we'll see you there.
Great. Thank you so much, Ploy, for recommending this event. We of course, we love Vietnamese food. When it comes to Vietnamese history, most likely we got the information from the US point of view, American movies, Western media. So it would be definitely really valuable for us to understand Vietnamese history from Vietnamese perspective. So stay with us. We will see you same time, 1 p.m. GMT. I will let you figure out what's the local time for you. So next week will be Vietnamese culture and sweet bitter story. See you next week. Bye.